Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Ask an Expert event. My name is Nick Laux. I'm the Education Program. We are a nonprofit organization committed to supporting and promoting Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument and its scientific and cultural resources. We share monument science through educational programs, carry out restoration and monitoring projects, and advocate for land management policies that support the biodiversity of this region. So we're glad you have joined us this evening to talk with landscape architect Allysia Angus. So the Ask an Expert events were started to create opportunities for folks to connect with experts who have worked in the Grand Staircase Escalante region and have expanded our understanding of GSE&M landscapes and ecosystems. So in slight contrast to our community lecture series, these events are meant to be interactive, a more informal Q&A with our conversation following the direction of our audience questions. Before we dive in and hear more from Allysia, I just want to give you a quick orientation to how to ask a question. There we go. There's the Q&A box. So if you mouse down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see an icon with little chat bubbles and says Q&A. So when you click on that, it'll open a window that you can type a question into. And then I'll field those questions and deliver them to Allysia. If you have any logistical questions, you're welcome to ask them there as well, and I will help you out response. You do also have the option to ask a question verbally, in which case you would press the raise your hand icon. That'll notify me, and when your turn is up in the question line, I'll give you a chance to ask that question. So I'm going to hand it over to Allysia now because she tells a much better story about how she got to where she is than I can. So she'll give a sort of brief presentation about the work that she does, how she got there, and then we will open it up for questions. Allysia, can you hear me? I think you're muted.
How are we now?
There we go. I can see your screen. It's not in presentation mode. There we go.
Okay. Well, that way I get to do this a second time. Thanks, Nick, and I knew that I would need your help with this. And thanks to Grand Staircase Escalante Partners for asking me to do this program tonight, and especially thanks to those of you that are joining us. So a bit of an introduction about myself. I have been working in this landscape for actually 20 years this year. I came to Grand Staircase Escalante as an intern in June of 2020. And I probably within, I think, 3 years of that became the monument landscape architect. So I've been doing this kind of work for quite a long time. And my educational background comes from Utah State, where I got my master's in landscape architecture and environmental planning. The presentation that I'm going to do, just to kind of get the ball rolling, because it was shared with me, and honestly, I was one of these people myself, is the profession of landscape architecture is one that's not familiar to a lot of people, and it's confusing, and it's often confused with, you know, in our culture, landscaping is often what people think of first. And landscape, as far as the program of landscape architecture, is very much looking at that very broad landscape that we exist within. And it can be urban or very much like the monument, which is a very rural and undeveloped landscape primarily. So I decided to focus my talk tonight, just to get the ball rolling a bit, on 4 primary areas that I've worked in. But before I go into those, I put together this word graphic, which many of you are probably familiar with, where online you can kind of grab a document basically and drop all the words in the document, and it will pick up the words that are used the most, and it will make these fun graphics out of them. And I took one of my current resumes and did that and got rid of all the small words, you know, the articles and whatnot. And these are some of the things that ended up showing up. And it was interesting to me, though not surprising, that the word planning popped up as the most used word, because I would say that that feels like to me something that I do on a daily basis. So the 4 things that I'm going to kind of give a bit of an overview of are the management of visual resources, the built environment, and then some sign discussion, like sign programming, sign planning, and then scenic byways. So the first of those is the visual resource management program. And this is something that BLM has very direct and detailed policy regarding. The management of scenic resources is something that we're charged to do via our guiding legislation as an agency. And there are 3 basic components to how we manage visual resources. First, we inventory so we can understand what we have. The next thing is we take that inventory and combine it with the needs for the variety of other uses and resources, and establish objectives in our land use planning efforts of how we'll manage our scenic resources. And then the last thing that's entailed in the program is determining whether or not our projects meet the objectives that we set forward in our plans. So this slide that's in front of you now is actually the cover of the fairly new, and something I'm really proud of, our visual resource inventory. We completed that in 2019. We did have the data, though we didn't have the report, which this is the cover for. We had the data for 2018, so it was able to be used in the recent planning efforts. And then there's just some little graphics there on the side that reiterate those different components. And then that chart is we take the pieces of the inventory, which is the scenic quality, how sensitive people are to change, and then how far away they are from typically viewing things. We meld those together and come up with kind of these categories. And that's what that, and it's a level of detail. More, I put it in there as a graphic, but it shows how formulaic we actually try to make this inventory, and how I think something people often say is that, you know, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and that scenery is based on just everybody's individual preference. And actually research shows us that things that are considered highly scenic are actually, across cultures and across all of us, they're very, very similar. They're things that we all value. So this is just getting into one of the 3 factors in a visual inventory, and it's the scenic quality. It's the what do things look like. So the landform is scored. If there's water present, it's scored. The vegetation and the patterns that it creates. Is there color in a landscape? Are there cultural modifications that either make something more interesting or actually degrade from it? So those things are all given scores. And these, the underlying images that you're seeing with the really long panoramics, those are highlighting regions of the inventory area, the monument, that were put into polygons, basically, where we said this place looks basically the same. So we're going to rank out this, and it could be, you know, several thousand to, honestly, to some of the units are probably over 100,000 acres. But it's all about, do they look quite the same? And for some of you that know the landscape quite well, those images on the bottom for that particular unit, that's by the blues. So, right, that's kind of where dinosaur resources are often found. And I even have an image in there that calls that out as something special in that that type of landscape. The map up in the upper right corner is when we've gone through the final kind of tallying and the scoring. They're given 3 rankings, scenic quality A, B, and C, high, medium, and low. And in the inventory area, almost 50% of this land base was ranked out as high, and less than 1% was ranked out as low. So for those of you that know this place, that probably doesn't sound like something that you don't, hopefully that you disagree with. The next factor in the inventory is gauging the sensitivity, how sensitive the public is to changes in the landscape character. And this one is where we do an analysis of the types of users, the amount of use an area has, adjacent land uses, like we have national parks on our periphery, and special areas, you know, like wilderness study areas that would make something sensitive to change. And so similarly, those then are ranked out, and the upper map in the right-hand corner just shows that within this particular category, that almost 60% of the landscape was ranked to be highly sensitive to change, almost 40% moderate, and then about 2% fell into the lower category. The last of these, which is honestly the one that's primarily a GIS exercise, once you figured out your what we call viewing platforms, where is it that people see things in the landscape predominantly? And often roads, you would guess that. The communities, so that underlying map that's really light colored, the green are primary travel corridors, little purple splotches, and they're fairly small, but those are the communities. And then there's some blue stars, and the blue stars are things like popular rec sites or overlooks, and they can even be from distances outside the boundary. So like overlooks at Bryce Canyon that look onto this landscape were also used. And then we ran what is a viewshed analysis. So again, a GIS exercise that lets you know what can be seen from those points and how close it is. And within BLM system, we basically bracket things by foreground, middle ground, so out to 5 miles. We have a middle category, which is 5 to 15 miles, and then seldom seen, areas that are either blocked by topography or they're beyond 15 miles. And so the foreground, middle ground in the map up at the top are the pink, the reddish colors, and about 50% of the land base ended up in foreground, middle ground. The seldom seen is the one, though, here because of our variety of topography, ended up at almost the other 50% with a tiny little bit in the background category. So, let's see, I'm gonna go back to that and just close it out. So like I talked about at the beginning of this section, the inventory, these 3 pieces, the sensitivity, the distance, and the quality are melded together. And that is information then as you would inventory any resource that you take into your planning efforts. And so we now have in this land base, new land use plans that have designated our resource management objectives. So the manner in which we will manage those lands, taking into account a variety of other uses and resource needs. So the visual resource management objectives are, in this instance, they're color-coded red, yellow, orange, and green. And VRM class 1, which you'll see there's a lot of red, those are areas that are policy driven to be managed for preserving the natural character, and they're predominantly our wilderness study areas. And then we have the 2 middle categories, VRM class 2 and 3, which allow for varying levels of change to the landscape, 2 lesser so than 3, and then areas that are green on this map are areas where more major modifications could be made. So this is the current schema of the management that we're operating under. And then I have on this topic a couple more slides, because the last thing that we do after we say how we're going to manage it is then we implement projects, and we have to go, are we managing it the way that we said that we would? So in this instance, I'm going to use a recreation project. And for those of you familiar with Hole in the Rock Road, there's a historic site, Dance Hall Rock, down on the southern end. And a few years ago, we decided to put in restrooms and a parking area there. There was an existing kind of user-created parking area that was fairly small, but putting restroom facilities out there was something that had been talked about honestly since my arrival. And this gives you a little bit of the project description. So parking, a vault toilet, a road, a few small site elements. And it ends up that this particular location is in VRM Class 2. So we're trying to retain the character of the landscape, have a low level of change, and have our project not attract the attention of the casual observer, which is kind of the real details of that objective. So the two images that you see, the one on the top is traveling south on the road, and then the one on the bottom is at Dance Hall Rock itself, standing on the platform. And Dance Hall Rock is a natural amphitheater. This site is very important to the Mormon pioneers who used it as a celebratory location to keep their spirits up, where they did music and danced as they were constructing the Hole in the Rock route. So one of the things that came up when we were scoping this project, we ended up partnering with the LDS History Group, and they particularly had feedback that they would like us to be very mindful of and try to protect the view from the dance floor itself, from inside the amphitheater, which is what you can see there in the lower image. So I'm gonna now show you, the whole time you were looking at the site already constructed, and these arrows up on the top show you that's pointing, and if you're using a really small screen, it may be hard to tell, but that's the top of the toilet. That's where the vault toilet is, and the parking is around it as well. And then the lower image, if we look at those three arrows, if we start with the left one, that's pointing to the reclaimed area where the parking used to be, which was a fairly visible scar. The second arrow is the road that came in, which has also been reclaimed. And then the one that's pointing toward the sandstone mound is pointing to where the toilet is. So the toilet is on, and the parking area are on the other side. So I feel like we were quite successful, particularly in protecting the views from the floor of Dance Hall outward. So those are my plant some seeds about how we manage visual resources. And I know that that was very quick. I actually helped teach a 5-day course in this for BLM folks and contractors. So a second thing in my career that I have worked on was the guidelines for a quality built environment. I was really fortunate early on to be tagged with actually leading a national effort. And so the production of this guidelines document is something that I was really, really fortunate to be able to be so closely tied to. And then I think I was also really, really fortunate, and am still, to be able to take the principles in it and seek to apply them on the ground in the projects that we construct. So with the built environment, the goals of it are that all the facilities that BLM constructs, the things that we do, not that other folks do on BLM lands, but that they be attractive and universally accessible, they be cost effective, sustainable, and responsive to the place and setting where they are. And all of that is getting at trying to elevate the image of the agency so that people, when they go to a facility, whether it's a visitor center or a trailhead, that hopefully they have a sense of BLM cares about this and they put thought into it, and they built a nice facility to help me as a member of the public, use this place. So these are just some pages from the inside. And one of the things that the document does is talks through the planning process and hits on the various stages of planning. This is just 3 of those. But I love to highlight this because we had incredible contractors working, and the graphic design and the examples and the format that they used for this. It turned out to be a really nice product. It includes usually either 2 to 4 pages on about every aspect of site design or facility type that you can think of. parking, trailheads, visitor centers, fire stations, grading, drainage, etc. And then we hit on those key principles about planning for use and users and picking the right site. Like if you don't pick the right site out the gate, you kind of already put yourself in the position of having to work a lot harder on the back end for a project to turn out well. In our lingo, we talk about preparing site analyses, like really understanding what we're working with. Do we have water? What are the slopes? How many, what are the trees and the shade patterns? What kind of views do I have? All of those kind of natural and ecological things. We called out using green strategies and designing a cohesive environment, and then designing things so that they're safe and that they're secure. And then that diagram over on the right-hand side shows some, again, of the nice graphics, but it also gets into detail. So when people are designing something, it's showing them dimensions. And that kind of reference, I will say from personal experience, is really, really important. Because a lot of that detail stuff is very hard to keep in your brain exactly. Like, now how large is, a parking stall for X, Y, or Z? So let's see. So I wanted to show you a couple examples then of taking the built environment into play on the landscape. And a project we did several years ago was an upgrade at Deer Creek Campground and Trailhead. The underlying image is the site plan for the campground, which is the main bit of it. And then for those of you that know the area, over on the far right-hand side, those are the little diagrams associated with the trailhead. And this has been constructed. We have done the improvements. I mean, one of the really interesting things we were trying to deal with here is, you can probably see there's a riparian area. There's a cliff on the side kind of running below the road as it wraps around it. But that driveway that's used for the campground is also the driveway for people accessing private property. There's an in-holding up the creek from there. And we were getting to the point with this campground that the users of the campground were parking such that the people needing to get home often couldn't get past them. And so a lot of the design was set up to have the spaces be more functional and to get the users parking in the camp spots, not like half in the road. And so far, as best I'm aware, it's worked quite well. And then I just put the little construction document that the design showing kind of the details of 4 of the campsites. And I have to give a big shout out. I work with engineering staff on a regular basis, and this is their work doing these things in CAD. There's a lot of conversation that goes back and forth, but I am, from a detail perspective, getting it on the page. I'm very grateful that I have support for that part. And then I just wanted to show with it constructed a few of the details. And I would say that a really solid plan at the highest levels of what you're planning to do is important, but the devil's in the details, right? We've all heard that. And I think really nice details on a project are kind of what really sell that story about improving image. And I have one little fun story. The photo that's on the right-hand side on the upper with the rock and the picnic table, that's buffalo berries, silver leaf buffalo berry, I believe, growing behind it. This area was utilized quite a bit during construction, and we made another camp spot in a place that we had to dig out quite a bit of that vegetation. So we healed it in, covered it in dirt. 2 months later, picked up big buckets of it, dug big buckets in the soil here behind this rock, stuffed them back in the ground, healed it back in, and I was very pleased that it grew. And this is the first season. It's several years now. It's much bushier, but this is the first site when you come in the campground, and there wasn't a lot of privacy for it. And so we had some success, honestly, in a really affordable fashion of reusing plant material. So I wanted to give a little shout out about that. So the next thing that I was going to talk about of the 3 is our sign work. And I've been involved in signage most of my career. And we were the pilot office for doing a sign inventory. And we were also a pilot office for rolling out a national look and feel associated with signage, which is what all this black backgrounded material that you're seeing is, and the blue and the arrows. Again, very somewhat tied to the built environment in that the signing at a national level, it was recognized that if we could get our signage to match, it would give us more of an identifiable profile. So the sign inventory work was done by the young woman that was in the image before, who was an intern that I had with one of the conservation corps for about 6 months. And she inventoried over 1,800 signs out on the landscape, and they're coded. The tool that she used, and I'm realizing part of one of the images on this slide went away, but this is using a mobile technology collector is the app that we use for this. And then it's brought into EGIS, so a GIS platform that is online. So it makes it really easy on the interface. And so the smaller box on your screen on the right-hand side is what her, well, it's actually what my iPhone looks like because it's a screen capture. But we use iPads in the field, but they take exactly the same information. So you have a big catalog. When you type on each of those, there's detailed information that goes into it. And then that's all fed in so that we can then go online and cruise around. And if I have a question about, somebody asked me about a sign, I can go online, open this program up, open these maps up, and see what at least was going on a couple years ago when the inventory happened. And, oh, that's funny. That was what it was. There was my shout out to ArcGIS. I don't know why it's on a delay. So I zoomed in a little bit more so that you could see the screen for EGIS, and the green dots are signs that are in good shape maintenance-wise. The red ones are ones that need attention. And I clicked on that one green one and popped up the info screen for it, which has a lot more information than we'll show in the box. But one of the things that's also linked in there is a photo at the very bottom. And so the photo is the one that I've laid onto the screen. So that particular point is this Escalante River Trailhead sign, and I can see, like I said, what it looked like a couple years ago. And it's incredibly handy. If you can think about a 2 million acre landscape that's got close to 2,000 signs on it, you can drive around on your computer and answer some questions as opposed to having to drive out in the field. It's an incredible time saver. So tying that in so we can know what we have on the ground as far as signs go. And it was really, I think, a great effort for the young woman who was the intern. She's now a full-time BLM employee, so I'm quite happy about that. But it allows us, knowing what we have, to then kind of transition things, because a lot of what we have out there is still some pretty old school stuff. And in this particular location down the Bird Trail, we actually, I think, have a sequence of signs, and you can see them, that I've got 6 there where it's like a hierarchy. And I think this is the one corridor along the monument right now that probably has the most consistent signage. You go past a portal sign, you get to the campground, and you have a sign that is smaller scale but is in the same scheme. You go inside the campground and you have a kiosk, which is what that Welcome to Deer Creek is, with the fees information on it. You go to the trailhead, you have another sign that matches, which is a little bit smaller. And then you go to the kiosk to go out onto the landscape where the trail register is. And then you have yet another kiosk that also has the same design schema. So these things kind of help set that mental picture, I think, and graphically for people, so that they definitely know that they're at Grand Staircase. At least I hope so. Okay, the last of these that I was going to share with you, and this goes back to really early in my career, but something that I'm quite proud of, and that is we are still, I guess, I hope, getting the benefit of the designation. I was on the corridor management planning team and prepared, along with others, the application to get Highway 12, Scenic Byway 12 designated an All-American road. And it continues to be the only All-American road in the state of Utah, which is the highest ranking, kind of the cream of the crop of the National Scenic Byway system. So this shows a bit of a hierarchy again, right, which is a pattern with a lot of things that I've shared. The orange labeled, that's the cover of the corridor management plan. One of its actions was to do a signage and interpretive plan, which is the cover of the one with the blue lines. A page out of that signage and interpretive plan is what we would actually do at the Head of the Rocks Wayside, which is one of the facilities on Grand Staircase. And it has instruction textually about what will happen from the interpretive themes perspective, and it has a little graphic of how the site would be developed. And then these two images that I'm sharing with you are what the site looked like before and what the site looked like immediately post-construction. If I took this picture today, there would be a lot of vegetation. There's quite a bit of rabbit brush, particularly growing in the areas off the sidewalks now. But the image with the boulders and the ragged edge of asphalt, there was no separation at the site between the travel lanes for the highway and the parking area, and we've now put a little bit of a median there. And this is one of my coworkers, Amber, at the time, and she's not quite 6 feet tall. If she had walked off a little bit further to the right, she would have gone into a gullied erosional area that was almost as deep as she is tall. So those are some things that we dealt with there to, I think, really have this site be one that, honestly, it's hard during the visitation season to drive by there now and not see people using and enjoying it, which I really enjoy for myself, getting to see people kind of taking advantage of these kinds of sites. Those are the 4 things, and I went a little bit longer than 15 minutes. So I hope that that's helped get at some of the things that I have done in my career here thus far. And those, I will just say, landscape architects are kind of rare in BLM, much more so rare than in the Park Service or the Forest Service. And I think because of that scarce skill situation, I definitely get to dabble in an array of things, and it keeps it ever, ever interesting. So I would love to entertain any questions that anybody might have.
Great, thank you, Allysia. That was a great introduction to the work that you do, and the questions are rolling in. So our first question from Sarah is, how do you incorporate Indigenous input into the visual resource inventory rankings to help inform your management objectives?
Our archaeologist does, I believe it's annual, if not semi-annual, face-to-face consultations. And this was one of the projects that he went and spoke with them directly about when we were doing it. So that was one means of bringing that in. And another is, in our particular effort, which was something we were just trying out, we did a Google Wiki map exercise. We tested it internally and had a variety of staff. And so I do remember at the time, one of our interns, or seasonals, I'm sorry, who has done a lot of cultural resource work and work with tribes on special places. He provided spot locations based on his knowledge with working with them as well.
Great. Our next question from Ken is, in the early 70s, a strategy to keep us from loving our public lands to death was called the fly trap approach, in which usage was concentrated in some areas to take the impact off of larger areas. Is this still a strategy?
I haven't heard of it categorized, interestingly, as the fly trap. I would say that focusing use into key locations and into more accessible locations is definitely one of the tactics that we've taken for management here. So, you know, having more developed recreational facilities along the highways and the primary travel corridors, as opposed to intentionally trying to pull people further into those areas that are less accessible.
Great, thanks. Our next question is, what is the process for designing interpretive signage for cultural resources? How do you decide to include, or how do you decide what to include on the sign?
So I have been fortunate in my career to have worked with people that are interpretive specialists, and that's what their background is. And to be straight up about it, from a planning of the content perspective, that is something much like I fill the role of the landscape architect, the engineer does a lot of the grading and the drainage and making sure some of the functional things that we're working together. And and most of my career I have had this, the interpretive planner has gone into that level of detail. So I'm trying to think. I don't know that I've been in the position where I've been the one kind of picking or choosing. So I don't feel like I'm really the best one to answer how that's done.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll have to get an interpretive specialist on one of our Q&As one of these days. Our next question is, what sort of follow-up or maintenance are you involved in after a project is completed? For instance, do you revisit the sites annually to check on how they're being used, and whether certain strategies have worked?
Yes, depending on the location, I would say that I am typically able to go see projects that we've constructed at least once a year, some of them more than that. We also have maintenance and on-the-ground recreation staff, some of the sites that they're at on a daily basis. So some of the feedback also comes from others. And then we get feedback from the public. You know, we definitely learn if we have constructed something that people don't think works.
Yeah, great. And a somewhat related question. So you mentioned the replanting of buffalo berry. The question asker says kudos. But do you do things like weeding of tumbleweeds and or cheatgrass?
We do weeding, and if I'd known that I was going to get this question, I have some great photos from about 2 years ago, where we weeded so many tumbleweeds at the White House Campground that we had kind of a mountain of them. I mean, that is definitely one of the issues that you have anytime you disturb soil here. Sometimes prior to you disturbing it, but it's going to have weedy species if it's in a use area. But once you disturb it, the first several years, particularly a couple of the weeds, and tumbleweed is a great one, not so great one. So, yep, we've had many a weeding party at several of these locations.
Nice. Our next question from Mike is, can you talk about visual considerations in managing riparian areas and in undertaking vegetation removal projects?
So I'm going to guess this is getting at the removal of Russian olive and possibly tamarisk, since we've done a lot of that in this area. And I can say that we did go out specifically to discuss the kind of tactics that would be taken in the Harris Wash area. And we had visual concerns and some others. And so I think the tactics are, when you're doing those types in the riparian area, part of the conversation that you're having from a visual perspective is you're analyzing what it currently looks like, and then you're, based on your experience, you're acknowledging what the hope is, what it will look like after the work is done. And in this regard, I've been able to say that naturalness will shift more toward species that are more appropriate for that location. But, to the average person, I'll kind of say that having one kind of vegetation that's reasonably similar, and I know they have differences, but if you think about it more, pulling yourself really far away and you see kind of a riparian corridor of one type of vegetation or another, they're kind of seeing greens in there. I don't know that the casual observer is going to be noticing the pattern differences that those of us would, that do know kind of that you're going to get the silver stuff, and that's Russian olive, as opposed to, say, willows or cottonwood, which are a more kind of vivid green. But as far as its effect on not meeting visual objectives, that's not something that would be a concern. So, and it's interesting too, because when you're removing something, there's a really different response to it, particularly in those limited kind of corridors, than when you're building like a permanent structure. That's been my experience. Like the removal of things is a quite different kind of response. I still, in the analysis, I describe it, but I don't know that I've answered that particularly well. But the removal of vegetation and transitioning it to a more kind of natural type, from a visual perspective, it doesn't have, from just a patterning and from colors, it's not a real dramatic change.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is that there's sort of, if you were to look at a riparian corridor from a sort of ecosystems perspective, that you might have a different understanding than if you're looking from a simply visual perspective, or, imagining the sort of casual viewer and what their visual experience is.
Right. Yes.
And Mike says he's also thinking of site of, or like vegetation removal projects. So does the visual management piece come into play for PJ removal as well?
Most definitely, and I've written a couple analyses associated with those, and they are ones where you get into the discussion of having design features such that those treatments look and appear natural, as opposed to having hard edges. And well, I think we've all seen veg treatments in forested, or even I've noticed them in sagebrush, where the patterning that's used to do the vegetation removal, it does not look natural. Like it's doing something that nature wouldn't mimic. And I think, I've had conversations with our folks here that are the ones that lead those projects. And we often talk about kind of fire lines and what a fire line would look like. And also the transitions, where you have thick forest and spotty stuff. And I'm hoping that we're going to try to test and replicate, if we implement some of these in the future, that latter method as well. You know, the kind of, you know, I personally hesitate to use the word feathering, though it's what a lot of folks will say. It's almost like it's more detailed and involved than what I think of when I process when somebody says feathering to me. But an intentional gradation, I guess, is how I would describe it. But most definitely, those projects are analyzed from a visual perspective, and my goal, at least, is to put design features in them such that they are on the landscape in ways that they're going to look as natural as possible. Mm-hmm. And we also, when we're doing the analysis, we have time frames, like one of our versus the long term. And you know, it's not the month after a project is implemented that you're kind of making your judgment call on whether or not it met objectives. You do get a few years, and you get to, I mean, it's like a 5 and a 10-year window, I believe, for, you know, short term and long term. Or you can define it and say, this is what I'm doing my analysis toward this many years.
Gotcha. Interesting. We have an audience member who expresses appreciation for the dance hall rock facility and has a suggestion about including kilometers on some of the distance signs, given the high number of international visitors in normal years. And then our next question is, what kinds of environmental or cultural protections does a scenic byway designation include?
Can you say that one more time?
Sure. What kinds of environmental or cultural protections does a scenic byway designation include?
So that corridor management plan that I shared, that is something that is developed byway to byway. And the types of protections that are detailed in those corridor management plans are, I think, I'd say very reflective of, you know, a given location that a byway runs through. And you would see different language in regards to the protection of the resources. And actually, to be an all-American road, there's 6 resources that we touched on there. And there's 6 that are within the program nationally. It's like cultural, historic, recreation, natural, scenic, and I can't remember the 5th one off the top of my head. But for an all-American road, you have to meet at least 2 or more of them. And we actually argued that we met all 6 of them back in the day, and we still would. But the primary thing that the protection is there for, I would say, that's the blanket that's associated with the kind of scenic byway regulations, is that if you do things such that you don't meet the criteria anymore. So it's a more broad, let's say, that particular resource, that if actions came to pass, that it was no longer intact, and it was what you got your designation for, that is kind of the level of protection ultimately, trying to avoid if that's a concern. I mean, I think in most instances, once something's designated, the pride of place associated with it carries quite a bit. And I would say for us locally, you know, the conversations that we get to have with the Department of Transportation, who is very involved in the management. Also, you know, it's within federal highways, the Scenic Byway program. It starts your conversations kind of from a slightly different place when you have a national designation.
Okay, great. Our next question is, did you take into consideration historic photos when rating scenic quality / view shed analysis? And the person asking the question says, for instance, in Yosemite, we used historic photos to help inform our scenic vista management plan.
No, we did not use historic photos. And within BLM's policy, the inventory, which is a slice in time, is about that slice in time in which the inventory is conducted. And then it is meant to be a living document that is updated as conditions change. Like if there was a really large scale fire on the landscape, that would be something that you would want to document and, if necessary, shift some of your inventory. The same as if you were in a location, let's step away from kind of here, but let's say we were in Wyoming or northern New Mexico in an oil and gas heavy use area. And if they had done their inventory 20 years ago, and then 15 plus years of oil and gas development, that would have very much shifted, particularly their cultural resource, things that the cultural modifications. So it's more honestly that our inventory is about what we have today and keeping it as accurate, and up to date moving into the future. Not to say that that's, understanding what the past, what things look like. I think that's a really interesting, super interesting kind of, and I love personally looking at historic photography, but that's kind of not the way our policy is set up for how our inventory is developed.
It's interesting how that maybe varies in lands areas.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question is, are visitor surveys ever done or ever relevant when performing viewshed analyses?
So I thought that question was going to go somewhere different. So we do surveys, and one of the projects that I didn't talk about that I was very involved in was a sense of place recreation experience baseline study, which was 4 years worth of focus groups. But that's off topic. So just to get it out there, you do use those tools to understand kind of some of the social resources. But as far as engaging using surveys for viewshed analysis, I think I would need to follow up with that person to understand that question a little bit better. Because a viewshed analysis, okay, so maybe they're getting at, this is the hard part, right? Like where you determine to set your points to run the viewshed, because the viewshed analysis itself is like a GIS exercise modeled. But to pick where the locations are to run that, I haven't used surveys for that. I don't know if others have. I could see that it's a tool that could be very valuable. I think I would say that to a degree, a lot of these projects where when it's in a project analysis arena, when we would be evaluating a project, when we do public scoping, and then when we send our draft environmental documents out to the public, that would definitely be, it's not a survey, but it's the time the public could say, hey, you didn't evaluate this project from the right location, or you missed this location and I think you should add it. And so again, not a survey, but a way for the public to influence like where we set up some of the points to do the evaluations from. So I hope that helps. And this is a question where if the person wants, my email's right there, I'd be happy to chat about that more to make sure I understand what you're asking better.
Yeah, great. I think I knew who asked this question, and I think she'll enjoy chatting with you more. So you guys can really have at it. So we are coming up on an hour, and could be a fun one to end on based on the document you sent me earlier. But the question is, do you ever get to think about sound as part of landscape analysis, or is it primarily visual?
So the way that I would say we as kind of federal agencies managing things, we definitely often package it up in more explicit boxes. And the Visual Resource Management Program has its own policy that helps us do that in as objective a way as possible. Now, what Nick just alluded to, and I'm psyched that I have this entree, this is another one of those many things, right? When I was supposed to only have 15 minutes to talk to you, and I doubled that by mistake anyway. But we just got back our final report from about 4 years of work doing an acoustic monitoring baseline for the monument. So Dr. Britt Mace over at SUU, who's worked with the Park Service doing this type of work for a very long time, we were fortunate to get him involved with us via an assistance agreement. And actually, one of my colleagues who's now retired, Laura Gale, who had also worked for the Park Service, she's the one who facilitated that, and then she retired, and I kind of helped carry it to the last little bit. And so we now have, let's see, there were 17 sites that were monitored, and there are, I think, 15,000 hours of audio.
Wow.
And the coolest thing about this is in many locations, the standard equipment that they were using to do this work, we were hitting the floor. So it was so quiet that it was like, we don't know like how quiet it really is. So they secured to come back, and they actually went to just the Dry Fork area where Peekaboo and Spooky are, which is interesting, right? That is, those of you who know the landscape, that's a fairly popular location for us. Mm-hmm. But they took the super sensitive equipment out there. And so that location is now recorded as one of the most quiet recorded locations in a protected area in the US. And there's the hope that the research will continue at some point in the future to go back to some of the other locations, which were also hitting the floor, but we did not have the time to go back and take more measurements. So I would say more so that just in more broader scale planning, not necessarily the visuals, is when the sound stuff comes into play. So as we have project proposals, and there's a little bit in the new planning documents in regards to acoustics, but that's pretty exciting. So thanks for asking that question.
Yeah, that's really fascinating stuff. Well, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to help us all better understand what a landscape architect is, and to share about the various projects you're involved in and answer our questions. And audience folks, again, if you have any further questions or follow-up questions, Allysia's contact information is there on the screen. And thank you all for it. And we'll hope to see you at our next event. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.